Liz Cheney, a strident critic of Donald Trump and former Republican Congresswoman who nonetheless voted with Trump 93% of the time when they were both in office, recently went on the Fox propaganda network to spar with Bret Baier, and she effortlessly swatted aside his false equivalences and his anemic defense of Trump's fascism, and then she quite literally used Bret Baier's own words against him to make her point, and it was glorious. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, I've got a couple of clips to play here, but as a reminder, Liz Cheney is not, will never be, and should never be our best friend. As I said, this is a person who voted with Donald Trump 93% of the time, more than Jim Jordan, more than Matt Gaetz. And I know right now, MAGA Republicans are saying, she's a rhino, but she's not a rhino. She was not a Republican in name only. She put her money where her mouth was time and time again. And so despite what MAGA cultists believe, the fact that a conservative as devout as she is, as somebody who, again, voted with Trump the vast majority of the time, is saying that Trump is a fascist and a threat to democracy, that's how you know it's absolutely true. So with that in mind, she went on the Fox propaganda network and sparred with an allegedly credible journalist, Bret Baier, and tensions were quite high.
I think it's a very real concern that he would take steps very quickly that would unravel the rule of law.
This is the Wall Street Journal. This is not a MAGA, op-ed here. And they say Trump as dictator is a classic case of projection, abuse executive power, ignore the law, run roughshod over individual liberties, retaliate against political opponents. Mr. Biden and his allies have done exactly what they warned Mr. Trump will do if he returns to the White House. Unlike Mr. Biden, however, Mr. Trump would have to contend with a hostile media and a federal bureaucracy that would be throwing pots, pans, and candlesticks at him at every step.
Well, I think they're wrong. I think if you look at, we don't have to guess about what next President Trump would do because he did it before. And he would not have around him the people that were around him, the people, frankly, that the country will hear from as his trial moves forward, who were all his appointees, people that he appointed to the White House counsel's office, the Department of Justice, his own family, people that told him on January 6th, as you and I were talking that day, actually, that he needed to tell the mob to go home. People who told him that what he was doing was illegal. Those people won't be around him. And, the rulings of our courts are fundamental to who we are as a constitutional republic. If a president doesn't enforce those rulings, they don't have weight.
Before we play the next part of the clip, this is important. Again, I've been in recent debates with Trump supporters or Trump-curious so-called enlightened centrists, and they've said the same thing. Listen, the guardrails held the last time, ergo they would hold this time if Trump's given a second bite at the apple. And that's just fallacious logic. The idea that a guardrail holds a car in a car accident on Monday doesn't mean those same guardrails will survive a second car accident on Tuesday, right? What happened before does not require that it will happen in the future, especially when these guardrails are maintained by people, flawed people perhaps with different loyalties who don't prioritize the Constitution above all else. So if Trump's in a position to surround himself and put levers of power in the hands of those loyal to him, those guardrails absolutely will not hold. So it's good that she's pushing back on that. We'll continue.
Right. But what about the point it made in this op-ed, specifically? And I understand what you're saying about the former president, what you feel about what would happen, but you haven't been vocal. You haven't been vocal about President Biden when, like, executive orders to cancel student loan, ban evictions, mandate COVID vaccines. Well, here's a list.
I think it's a very different
After the SCOTUS ruling,
are you going to let me answer the question?
Yeah, I am. Just let me list them. After the SCOTUS ruled against it, he still used regulatory means to write off, the student debt, wall off 1.5 million acres of land for fossil fuel. What this basically is saying is that there are things that have been done outside of the rule of federal courts that you haven't weighed in on.
Well, first of all, I don't think it's true that I haven't weighed in on those. And I think a lot of those, if you look at the kinds of things that he's done with respect, for example, to energy policy, with respect to setting aside lands across the West, I've been very vocal that I think those policies are wrong. It's very different from a president. And look, you wrote a book about George Washington. The last chapter of your book is called The Gift of a Peaceful Transition of Power. That is what we're talking about.
Yeah, but this is not about me.
That's right, but that's a very important concept. Let me finish my answer, because every single president, Republican and Democrat, since George Washington, has ensured the peaceful transition of power. Donald Trump tried to seize power. So we can disagree with Biden policies, but the fact that he tried to seize power, the fact that he ignored the rulings of 61 courts, the fact that he ignored his own attorney general, his own White House counsel, who told him what he was saying about the election was false. It wasn't true. His claims were false, and he went out and made them anyway, knowing that. The extent to which he, while a violent mob was assaulting the Capitol, he wouldn't tell them to leave. Instead, he tweeted against his own vice president, and he poured fuel on the flames. Those are lines that can't be crossed. And look, this isn't about policy. I voted with Donald Trump 93% of the time. This is about the nation. It's about the republic. It's about the Constitution.
100%. And I would say, as well spoken as that was, and the fact that she pushed back, and I love how she used Bret Baier's own words against him. So I've talked about before how, President Washington was the ultimate statesman with respect to his relationship with power. He embodied the Cincinnatus principle, both at the end of the Revolutionary War when he gave up power as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. I mean, he could have rounded all the so-called founding fathers up and declared himself King George I, and he chose not to. He renounced his commission. He retired. And then when they basically pushed him, prodded him to be the first president of the United States, he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to do it for a second term. And then finally he put his foot down at the end of his second term and said, listen, I'm out. We need to move on from me. So he laid down power twice, 3 times potentially, if you consider the fact that he was willing to walk away at the end of his first term. That's an extraordinary, that is probably the single most important civic tradition we have, which is the peaceful transfer of power. It's what distinguished the United States at the time from every other contemporary power, because most other people would have done, and not instead of the Cincinnatus principle, would have adopted the Napoleonic principle, right, and seized power for themselves. Donald Trump is an aberration in that respect, because he goes out of his way to try to seize power in ways that even very ambitious, greedy, corrupt presidents, say like Richard Nixon, didn't even do. So Trump is a unique aberration. And I love the fact that she clarifies, listen, and others have said this too, you can deal with bad policy. Mitt Romney says this all the time. If you think President Biden's policies are bad, well, there's a Democratic Republic in the aftermath of Joe Biden. Joe Biden, we have no indication, would try to seize power or resist the peaceful transfer of power. So you can overturn bad policy. You can remedy bad policy. But there are things that are more important than that. And that's, I think, the phrase that she didn't use, which she should have, which is that the structure of the Democratic Republic is more important than any individual policy. So if you think that President Biden isn't doing enough to keep us energy independent, even though progressives like me will tell you he's actually, in some respects, gone too far to try to cater to the fossil fuel industry, because he was handing out drilling and fracking permits at a higher rate than Donald Trump ever did, right? So, but let's say that that's you're conservative and that's your position. Well, you can deal with that in the next administration. That can be reversed. That can be remedied. That's not going to threaten the Democratic Republic as a whole. And by the way, we are energy independent. I think we're producing as much oil and natural resources now as we ever were under Donald Trump. So the facts are not on the Republican side. But there are things that are more important. Country should come before party, should come before person. And I think it's good to point that out, because Bret Baier is saying, well, listen, the Supreme Court struck down Biden's ambitious student debt forgiveness program, and then he used other legal means to continue to cancel student debt. Well, that's not seizure of power. The Supreme Court didn't say, you can never cancel student debt ever, Mr. President. They just said that this particular avenue for trying to, wipe out as much student debt as he did, they believed was unconstitutional. And so he did different kinds of student debt using different legal mechanisms at his disposal. And the courts haven't decided whether or not, that they have not said that new tactic is illegal. The COVID vaccine mandate, when the court said that the president can't use the Department of Labor or OSHA to force companies to vaccinate their workers, what did Biden do? He rescinded the executive order, and it never went into effect. So those are examples of Biden actually complying with the courts, unlike Donald Trump and what Donald Trump says he will do in a second term. So Bret Baier lost the argument. That Wall Street Journal op-ed that he quoted was terrible. It sucks. It would lose the debate. And Liz Cheney is a good foil in this respect. I love how persistent she was. And again, just want to say, she's not our ally. She's not our best friend. She is an ally of convenience, in the sense that even she is aware that Donald Trump is a fascist and understands that stopping that is more important than quibbling with Democrats over policy issues. So I say that we use her, get as much mileage out of her as possible to the extent that she is effective. But remember, she's not our best friend. We should not lionize or beatify her. But I love this conversation, this interview with Bret Baier. I think it's top notch. And we'll see if she ever gets an interview on Fox News again. But I wouldn't be surprised if this is her last appearance. Let me know what you think in the comments.